Hi, would you like to know how to motivate people through conversations? Well, then this session is for you. Today with us is Professor Jonathan Lee from Northern Arizona University. John is an expert in motivational interviewing, and I had taken some training with him in the past. That said, if you have missed the first part of this video, make sure to go back and check that one out because that's the introduction to motivational interviewing and how you can apply it in your everyday conversation. In this part two, we are actually looking into some of the techniques used in motivational interviewing that you can apply in everyday conversation. We also practice some of these techniques, but since it's the recording, you unfortunately won't have the opportunity to do so. That said, there's still a lot of techniques and valuable tips as well as questions that you might enjoy if you, for example, want to find new ways on how to support people in feeling or getting motivated. With that, welcome back, John.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks to those of you who have returned and those of you who might be new. What we're going to be discussing, of course, is an introduction to motivational interviewing as it exists across a great number of different areas, both educational, business, supervision, change-oriented coaching models, etc. The learning objective I had for the group Tuesday was to be able to define and describe the key concepts of motivational interviewing and to describe the MI spirit and ORs. Don't worry if you're new, we're going to be doing some more in-depth look at these things as well. Today, I'd also like to give you the opportunity to apply some of these skills, and we'll do that in a scripted fashion, so don't feel like you have to have control of any of this. It'll be very scripted. It's much more about the experience than it is you demonstrating some kind of overall proficiency with this. When we last left on Tuesday, if those of you who are with us, I shared with you kind of 3 motivational interviewing inspired communication tips. You know, these really were take-home messages, and what I asked is if anybody was willing and able, if they would, work to hold one of these conversations with someone, to give this a shot, to try to talk less and listen more, by filtering change and sustain talk. Something that we learned last time was that people speak about the changes that they're most interested in their lives by using change talk, which is talk that supports the opportunity and the possibility of change, or sustain talk, which is that type of communication which supports not changing or keeping the status quo. We talked a little bit about reflective listening, and we're going to do some more of that today in our 50 minutes or so that we have. We also talked a lot about staying in the moment and in the present when you're working with someone, particularly in this particular field of motivational interviewing, as you can often jump ahead of someone's readiness if you're not quite with them in the moment. The second communication tip that I shared was to tame the desire to fix things. It's common for all of us who have a great deal of compassion to want to fix that which we see as a problem for someone else. But as we know from a great deal of research, even back into the 60s from Thomas Gordon, that tends to be a roadblock, and that we want to avoid the idea of providing unsolicited advice, confronting someone, or persuading them. And so taming that desire to fix things and letting someone else talk about that change actually gives them space to talk themselves into change. And finally, then the third tip is supporting someone's autonomy, asking for their ideas rather than giving your own. And of course, there's always a time to share, but when you wish to share, let's ask permission for that. Because again, unsolicited advice can be a bit of a challenge. Now, if there's some of you out there that gave that a try and tried some of these out with someone in your world, it would be nice to have a call out in the chat box right now to let us know how that went for you. Give us a message. How did it go? And if you're new to the training today, maybe you could reflect on one of these and provide a response or a reflection on how you feel about these communication tips. So I'll wait just a minute and see if someone gave it a try and wants to respond, or if someone would like to reflect on these communication tips before we get going today. Ingo, listen more and not fix lasted only so long. Could do 10 minutes with my brother. Working with family with motivational interviewing is very challenging. So you had a challenging start to go. Lorenza, good, but it was hard to let my own thoughts come into the conversation or my opinions of what you should do. Yeah, that's we do want to avoid those opinions, right? That's really good on your part. Letting your own thoughts come through, sometimes we're often stifled a bit when we're learning a new communication system or a new clinical practice, right? It's more about how to do it, and we forget to kind of allow ourselves into it. If you remember, if you were with me on Tuesday, the individuals who developed motivational interviewing 40 years ago or so, Bill Miller and Stephen Rolnick, have often said that they should have named it motivational conversations. So sometimes you just need to let yourself go. And these types of tips or things that I'll share with you later today will come as you learn more. Kim said she focused on listening and what worked for everyone in working out a lease in NYC. Wow, it worked beautifully. It's funny, isn't it, that listening, just sometimes taking the back seat and being in the moment and engaging in a real active listening kind of stance, what it can do. I'm really glad to hear that. Catherine, I reflected on my fixing and how it might clash with thinking as a designer. Oh, that's very interesting, Catherine. If this was a longer session, I would love to go deeper into that thought. Fixing can be a challenge. It's not only a roadblock for the individual that you're working with, because it comes from you, it's not from their point of view, but also because you're spending a lot of time and a lot of cognitive load considering how to fix, which means that you might not be as present with the individual as you're working with them. Well, thank you all very much for sharing. I appreciate that opportunity, and let's go ahead and get started with the rest of it today. We're going to talk just a little bit about the motivational interviewing spirit, the spirit of motivational interviewing. And these are concepts that we adopt as we enter into change, supportive relationships with someone, so that we might avoid manipulation. And I happen to have a colleague here at the University of Northern Arizona who is also a motivational interviewing network of trainer member and motivational interviewing expert. And she has a lovely video on the spirit, which is only about 2 minutes. And I thought we might like to share in Dawn Clifford's ideas about the spirit in motivational interviewing.
Take a moment to think about the vibe you give off to your client in a health coaching or a motivational interviewing session. Do you come across as judgmental, condescending, impatient? These are all the traits we want to avoid in a motivational interviewing session. Today we're going to talk about the spirit of motivational interviewing. My name's Dawn Clifford. I'm a motivational interviewing trainer and also a professor of nutrition and public health. The spirit of motivational interviewing is made up of 4 components. First component is partnership. We want to build a lasting relationship with our client, create a partnership that they feel comfortable, that they want to come see us. And we can do that by putting them in the driver's seat on their behavior change. We develop this partnership by asking them what they want to talk about. We develop this partnership by asking them to come up with ideas for why they want to make this change, and maybe even come up with ideas for how they might want to go about making this change. We develop partnership by checking in with the client first. The second component of the spirit of MI is acceptance. Acceptance meaning we accept our clients just the way they are. They don't have to make a single change to gain our approval. We are there to fully support them regardless of whether they decide to make a change. The third component of the spirit of MI is compassion. Compassion is compassion. We're there for them and them alone. We're not there for self-gain. We're not there for making money. We're really there and authentic and genuine with our patients and clients because we care about them as human beings. And finally, the last tip of the spirit of motivational interviewing is evocation. Evocation is a fancy word for asking questions. It is the interviewing in the phrase motivational interviewing. Basically, with evocation, it just means that you're asking the clients good questions to get them to think about their ambivalence for change and to specifically think about their personal reasons for wanting to make that change. So through asking a series of questions, getting at their values, their motivators, the idea is that they come up with their own solutions for change as well as their personal motivations from within. That's the MI spirit or the vibe or aura that you give off in your sessions. I'm Dawn Clifford, and this is your MI tip of the day.
So we see the idea that, the spirit consists of these pieces, these elements. You can often use the acronym PACE to follow through. Simply put, it's a way of engaging people that helps us to avoid manipulating them with these skills, because it is much more about acceptance and compassion and partnership and evocating or eliciting their own thoughts around this change. Now, along with this, there are particular skills that we utilize during the motivational interviewing process, and many of these will be very much known to you, practiced by you in your own work, and might not be something new. However, these skills are used quite strategically in motivational interviewing. The ones that we will focus on the most today probably are going to be affirmations and reflections, because they tend to be a little bit different than most other clinical practices. Open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries make up the skills that allow us as implementation and prevention scientists to measure the quality of this coaching scenario, which is something that is missing from a great number of different coaching platforms. My ability to measure the quality with which someone uses motivational interviewing to coach another person through change allows me to account for the variability in the outcome of the client, which is something, of course, as a researcher and scientist is very important to me. So I'm going to move forward with just a brief explanation of these skill sets to you, some examples, and then we're going to move into an opportunity for you to choose, if you'd like to break into groups with others and practice these skills in a scripted scenario. So remember, I'm taking the weight off your shoulders. You don't have to feel as though you've mastered or you've got some level of proficiency with this. But I do wish you to experience what some of these are in light of working with another person. We'll do that right after we move through these 4 components. Open-ended questions are those that require more than kind of a one-word answer. This is nothing new to all of you, I'm sure. It keeps a conversation flowing. It invites and encourages elaboration on particular topics, especially if we ask these questions in response to someone's change talk. It avoids inadvertent assumptions. It avoids us directing the conversation because it allows others to bring forth their thoughts and their perspectives and their concepts rather than our own. That holds to the spirit of motivational interviewing. And so really, a variety of different examples of these are: how might these activities benefit your future? What barriers do you perceive that might be in the way? I wonder for a moment if you would think about the individual that you might have tried a little bit of this, our communication tips with, between Tuesday and today. And maybe you could type to me in the chat box here one open-ended question that you gave or provided. And if you haven't used it with someone, think of one that you might use with a client or an individual that you hope to use these skills with here in the future. I'll watch the chat box for some open-ended questions. What do you like about smoking? Yeah, absolutely. At times we have to confront those things that keep us in behaviors that can be detrimental. How is your anger benefiting you? That's an intriguing question. It inspires some deep critical thinking, doesn't it? And some realization of the ambivalence that might come along with the anger that they're showing. How does that scenario make you feel? It's so important to bring out emotions, and when they're brought out, it's so important to identify those and to kind of affirm that those are present in the individual's life, particularly when they're considering some form of change. Thank you for those. I have a few here that might be interesting for us to think about. Let's go through these and decide if they think they are or not. Adnan, I don't want to forget yours though. What would you prefer to have happened? What do you see as the upside of quitting? Absolutely, thinking about the benefits of what is to come. Open-ended questions that are really directive. I see you've all used really great examples of directive towards that change, or exploring what might not be right about the current status quo. Thank you very much for those. Open-ended or closed-ended? Are you feeling uncertain about these activities? Fairly closed. A quick yes or no could come from our client. What might things be like in your world in 2 to 3 months if you decide to work on this change? Absolutely one that comes quite open, allows a person to range across very many different perspectives. What might meeting with your colleagues affect your decision? What about, it should say, excuse my typo there. Very open for someone to range through things and to explore what might occur in the future. Do you think you're helping or hurting the situation? Quite closed. Other ways to open that question would be important to explore. During your day, do you make any time for yourself? Again, fairly closed with a simple answer, but really close to being quite open. Tell me about some things you've tried before. Absolutely open and ready for someone to provide their own perspectives. I want to move on to affirmations. Affirmations tend to be a little bit challenging within the motivational interviewing sphere as we hold affirmations back until we see individuals' behaviors, beliefs, intentions, or values that correspond with the change that they might be considering. These often build confidence when we provide affirmations, and they're much more effective when they're genuine and specific, not evaluative. Many of these things you've heard in the past, that when I say I really like that, it takes away from the individual, and it's evaluating that, meaning that there also might be something that I might not like. So affirmations, believe it or not, tend to be the lowest frequency of skill that is used in motivational interviewing, but they also tend to be the most powerful. Because when you've developed an alliance or a relationship with an individual, and that individual is experiencing the spirit in terms of the variety of compassion and acceptance and partnership that you might be showing them, when you find or see mobilizing change talk towards the change that they're interested in, and you provide and stop and provide a really genuine affirmation for that thought or that movement or that perspective forward, the impact of that tends to be greater than we see with things like good job and way to go and keep at it, which are affirmational, but they might not be affirmations in the motivational interviewing sense. Very specific acknowledgement of behavior, beliefs, intentions, and values that are purposefully communicated towards change and the change behavior that they might be considering is what we would utilize as coding for an affirmation in motivational interviewing. Reflections tend to be the highest frequency use of skill in motivational interviewing. And in fact, the quality standards for motivational interviewing includes ratios of reflections to questions, with reflections being much higher in frequency than questions, equating to quality in the motivational interview. Reflections are spoken responses to an individual's communication to you, their utterances. Reflections are a way of giving back information, kind of like a mirror, in a sense. Looking in a mirror to see what we just said, hearing it back in a paraphrased fashion helps us to explore that thought process so much more deeply. So these are paraphrases. They're not parroting. No one wants to feel like they're on the couch with Dr. Freud when you're being parroted. So paraphrases are really ultimately very important here. And it lets the other person know that you're not only just listening to them, you're in the moment and present with them, but that you're attempting to understand them. And reflections are very important in the face of change talk. When you hear someone utter things like, I really think I should do that, or I've given that a shot once, those are the things that are most in need of reflecting back to someone so they can hear what they've already said. They can hear again their movement towards change. Now, there are levels of reflection in motivational interviewing. There are two that are most important that we'll discuss today. Simple reflections, which are repetitions, still rephrased, but they're repetitions of the person, but they don't add emotions or values or our hypothesis about what they really thought. They're very simple and straightforward reflections. When someone tells you how busy they are and there's no way to put this in their schedule and I just don't know what to do anymore, the simple reflection to that kind of sustained talk is, this is really challenging. Demonstrating that you're with them, you hear them, you're acknowledging the state that they're within. On the other side of the coin is the complex reflection, which expands the meaning of their utterance. It's an attempt to understand, much like a hypothesis, like I think you're going this way, and of course, from the clinician, that's always towards the movement of change or the focus of change. And it moves that line of thought forward rather than holding them back. And it's often effective. In other words, we're reflecting feelings and acknowledging the feelings that people are experiencing there. And so when someone says to me, you know, I tried that, I've taken one step on it, there's the change talk. They might add on to it, but it didn't work. My job in motivational interviewing then would be to provide a complex reflection to the first part of that sentence. I might say something like, you've started the process of moving towards this change. That must feel really good to you to take that first step. In other words, what I'm doing is highlighting one side of this argument, change talk versus sustained talk, because both of these often come in the same sentence as someone is dealing with their ambivalence and thinking about the change that they might move forward with. Finally then, before we get to our group kind of process here, our summaries. Now, summaries are a form of reflection. They can be very simple. They can be very complex. But they're collecting bits of change talk that has been offered by the client over the past 10, 15 minutes that you've been working with this individual. And it's like giving them a bouquet of flowers. They act as an affirmation when you review the change talk that you've heard over several elements, and you give that back to a person in a quick summary. It's affirmative. It's acknowledgement of the movement forward. It can also be used to refocus the conversation towards change. You may hear a few tidbits of change talk, but a lot of sustained talk. And one way to help refocus that is to pick out that change talk, just like a small bouquet of flowers, and then provide a summary that includes those, possibly asking a question about the change talk after you provide that little bouquet. You know, we also have large bouquets that we can give to people, right? To wrap up a conversation, to transition to a different topic. And those large bouquets are more like a tool. Time is up with our session today. They have limited time, and so you provide an overall kind of summary of what has happened. In motivational interviewing, these summaries are about the change talk that has been provided throughout the session that you might have been working with them. And so, I would like to provide you a taste of motivational interviewing, an experience to have with another person here in our group today, if you choose to do that, in which you can, one person will describe a little bit of change that they've been considering, and the listener, the motivational interviewer, will provide some questions from a scripted piece that can help individuals get there. And so here's the directions. You'll be broken into groups of 2, and you'll decide between speaker and listener. The speaker is the individual who has some change they're thinking about. The listener is the motivational interviewer. If you're the speaker, please identify something about yourself that you want to or have been thinking about changing. Simply put, just a simple description of something that you've considered changing. Be prepared to share with your partner, the listener. Be prepared to share with them just a quick 30 seconds or so on the issue, just the basics. If you decide to be the listener in your group or your pair today, I would like you to ask 3 questions, one at a time, listening between each of your partner's responses. I'm going to put those questions in the chat box here in just a moment for you. After each response, provide a quick reflection that shows you were listening, right? Give them a little feedback, just a little bit, not a lot. Just make sure they know you're in the moment with them. Then ask the second question. Listen, provide a little response, ask the third question, listen, and then give a very short summary of what you've heard. What kind of change talk did you hear there? And then really affirm them for their willingness to share. Yeah? So here in just a moment, Ingo's going to break us into groups. I'm going to paste into the chat box for you those questions which might be most helpful in this. Motivational interviewing has a map, a navigation guide that you can use to think about what process of this change focus that you were in with an individual. And what's important about these 4 stages here is to remember that they're not about the meeting, right? I don't focus my meeting time. If I have 45 minutes, I don't, segregate those into engaging, focusing, evoking, planning. These processes are about the behavior target and moving it through these processes. And so you might have a number of different things you're juggling with an individual, each of them at a different stage in this motivational interviewing process. And so please remember, this isn't a focus of a meeting. This is how each behavior change might be in a different process altogether. Now, the engaging process is one where we're really working on our empathy. We're trying to strive to understand their perspectives, right, without instilling my own. It's very Rogerian, Carl Rogers. It's very much a client-centered style of practice. During this time, we're still using our skill set, our ORs, to understand their ambivalence and the dilemma that they might be having. Most importantly, we need to discover what their values are, their future perspectives, the orientation that they hold about the profession or the personal life in which this change kind of is situated. When we have some of those, we can keep them and attach them to that change behavior focus later to raise the importance of it. So the engagement process typically happens once and is refreshed every now and then when you meet with a client on multiple occasions. But often our sessions with motivational interviewing start by talking about their own values, their life perspectives, and future orientations. And there's some sample engagement questions here, although I could have put reflections or affirmations as well. What do you find most important in your role as a teacher, a supervisor, a business person, a student? What are you hoping for in the future? Whether or not it is associated with the change doesn't matter too much. You're trying to capture who they are. And what is a priority for you today in relationship to that future? The second process that is very important is focusing. And it is an ongoing process, kind of seeking and maintaining direction towards that change, finding that one behavioral aspect of this priority for them right now that they wish to change. It's much more about us serving as a guide in motivational interviewing than direction, or purely empathetic and Rogerian, just only kind of running around the mulberry bush with the person. There is some guidance to what happens here in the way that we reflect and respond to individuals. Now, when we utilize motivational interviewing in a coaching or a conversational style, the next stage requires a change goal focus, right? So when we get to the point where the person says, yeah, out of all the stuff we've been talking about during our focusing here, this one is really priority for me today. At that point, we can move to the next kind of area, which is evocation. Here's some sample focusing questions. Is there a specific change you'd like to make that you think might help make things better? What feels most important to you right now? What could we talk about today that would be most helpful? These are very general. Often they're a little more specific given the area in which you might be working. Finally, one of the most important pieces of motivational interviewing, and that's the evocation process. Engagement, focusing. We find through focusing the behavior that they're most interested in, priority for today, and that's when we fall immediately into evocation. You could add to the end of this label evocation of importance. What we're doing at this stage is taking 5 minutes, 6 minutes to ask some questions, provide reflections, affirmations, and summaries that elevate the importance of that behavior change. This is the one aspect of most problem solution focused therapies that is missed. When a clinician hears what is most important to the person to work on, and it's specific enough that it can be worked on, they often miss this stage completely and go right to planning. Let's plan to fix it. And we forget to stop and elevate the importance of that change. When we elevate the importance of that change, we heighten the possibility that they will perform that change behavior outside of your relationship when they leave with you. And so to evoke is to ask questions which the only answer is change talk. Consultants guide, I'm sorry, the student is left in here. That's from an educational application of this same training. The individual that you're working with, we guide them into talking themselves into the change with these questions. Remember, from focusing, you've got to have a target behavior before you get to this point. And finally, remember that we're trying to elevate importance. Now, some sample questions here. How would you make the change to make, or how would making that change make things better for you? What other benefits are there? What would be the drawback of keeping things the same? Which, believe it or not, when people talk about what's wrong right now, that's motivating change talk. How important is this change to you compared to the other areas that we might focus on? Again, kind of getting them to think about change talk rather than sustain. Interestingly, you can really think about how to focus your work on change talk by considering kind of pros and cons of the behavior change that they're most interested in. So if you look at the way I think here in this little box, you might see that if we ask about the advantages of the status quo, we're going to come up with sustain talk. That would be like asking, so what's good about not going to the gym? We don't want those answers to come from the person. We want the weight of our facilitation with them to be on the side of change. And so I typically would try to ask about the advantages of change or the good things about change. For example, tell me what might happen in 6 months if you do go to the gym twice a week. What comes from that question, you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner of that square, advantages and change, is change talk. Similarly, if I ask about the disadvantages, what's not so good about the status quo, that's change talk. Well, I don't have the time, or if it's the gym, you know, I'm getting a lot of weight here. I'm worried about diabetes. I'm not very flexible anymore. My wife and my partner doesn't like how I look. Change talk, because it's motivating to get out of the status quo. I can also, although I don't want to, ask about the disadvantages of change. Sustain talk comes from that. And so oftentimes you can compartmentalize what you're thinking about and how you might want to respond to someone. And in the questions that I provided to you in the sidebar there, these were evocative questions, questions that lead to change talk. And they were categorized in areas that we typically focus on in the evocative stance: desires, abilities, also known as strengths, reasons, and needs. I often ask my clinical students to kind of paste these onto their notebook that they carry around from session to session so that they can quickly look down and go, I got to get myself an evocative question. I've just heard some change talk. Let me bring that out with some of these evocative questions here. Finally, then, in the process of motivational interviewing, we have planning. Planning really is trying to consolidate commitment to raise confidence in the individual. We want to ask key questions to determine their readiness about this. We want to assist them in making very specific change plans. And when we see them again, we want to revisit those plans to see if we need to work more, throw it out, change it altogether, plan around barriers that they might have faced. And, you know, sample planning questions that are important during that stage what would be the first step? Again, remember, people have thought about a lot about this change. They probably have been through steps in their mind before. What ideas do you have in getting started for making this change? And what would a successful week look like if you did indeed complete this change at 100%? And so I think I've taken us right up to the time. I'm very happy to have been with you today. I do and I will paste this site, if you are new to us today, into the chat box. It's simply a Google site that gives you a little more in-depth look at the theory and the components of motivational interviewing that we've talked about here today.
How did it go? I hope you took something away from this and you found a way to incorporate some of these techniques into what you're already doing. Some of these techniques you probably used in the past, some of these might be new. For me, it was affirmations that made a big change in the way I coached in the past. But what was it for you? Feel free to leave a comment. Further, if you want to know more about motivational interviewing, John left us with a couple of resources that he shared after the Q&A, which was not part of the recording. I have summarized these in the description below, so make sure to check them out. That said, if you want to participate in one of the upcoming live sessions, make sure to head over to schoolofbecoming.org, where you will find all of our upcoming sessions. Of course, all of them are free and all of them are taught live. With that, thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm looking forward to see you in another video, or if you want, live in one of our upcoming sessions.